start with these. So 11 and 13, we'll definitely do those to start. Everyone else has the. Make sure you have that out. So we actually are going to do a short quiz tomorrow over this. We spent like a little over a week, and it seems like for us went longer because we had like a lot of days in between. But I want to make sure you understand how to do all these, and then we're going to have a 10-question quiz over this so that we can move on to the next topic. All right. So again, any questions that you have, make sure you ask them. All right. So the first one that was up there was number 11. And number 11, I wrote a little hint up there for you to help. You will not have one this hard on the actual quiz, but let's go ahead and write this out. So you're supposed to multiply by 1 minus cosine over 1 minus cosine. What happens when you do this, the top we're actually just going to leave as is right now. Sine squared theta is 1 minus cosine theta. And you'll see why in a second. The bottom, we actually have to FOIL this because it's two binomials. So it becomes this times this. We do our first, it is 1 times 1 is 1. Outer is minus cosine theta. Inner is plus cosine theta. And then last would be a minus cosine squared theta. That's our process there. Then you'll see what happens. On the bottom, these middle two terms cancel. And that's the reason why we multiply by this. This is called the conjugate. When you multiply by the same thing except the opposite sign, it gets the middle terms to cancel. That's why we do it. All right, and then what we're left with then is sine squared times 1 minus cosine over 1 minus cosine squared. All right, this is the middle terms canceled. All right, now what's the next thing we could do? Yeah? Right, this is equal to sine squared. So then we have sine squared is 1 minus cosine over sine squared. Those two actually cancel. Top and bottom. So we're left with 1 minus cosine. We actually don't have a good theorem to allow us to write this as a single trig function. This is okay as our final answer right there. Now that is not sine. It's not sine because it's not squared. It has to be squared. So we're going to leave that as our final answer, 1 minus cosine. I know someone said 13. Did anybody also want to see 12? You guys understand what to do on 12? What did I not say? The answer is secant, I think, right? Yeah, the answer is secant. Let me do that one. 12 and 13 are both a little bit challenging. All right, so we're supposed to add these together. How can we add these? What do we have to do? Do they have the same denominators? No, they don't, right? This one's just the denominator of 1 right now. So to add those, you need the same denominator. Well, this denominator is cosine, so we multiply this by cosine over cosine. Right? Then you're left with cosine squared over cosine plus sine squared over cosine. Now they've got the same denominator, so we can go ahead and add them together. Then we get cosine squared plus sine squared over cosine. Should recognize this one. This is like the main one, right? Pythagorean identity. Sine squared plus cosine squared. It's just 1 over cosine, and 1 over cosine is secant. And that is our answer. I know someone said 13 as well, so we'll do that one. Did anybody figure out the best way to do 13? Yeah? What did you do?
Take out the tangent on the outside parentheses.
Notice these both have a tangent. So we actually want to factor out that tangent. And notice what you're left with is a cosine squared and a sine squared. So that's going to be good. So we pull out a tan theta. We're left with cosine squared theta plus sine squared theta. So we just pull out GCF. And this is 1. So we just have tan times 1, which is just tan. So that's fine. So if anybody else. 13, 11. All right, what are some other ones? So there's got to be more that you guys want to do. Any on what are these? Verifying. And we got to take a quiz over this tomorrow, so I'm guessing you have more questions. Which one? 18. All right. All right, so 18. Now these verify ones, they're kind of interesting because we already know the answer, right? We just have to basically try to get to the answer. All right. So whenever you see a squared and a 1, right, you're probably going to replace it. So you have a 1 plus tan squared. So then you're going to want to look at your trig identities, and I'll give you these tomorrow as well. So you're going to pull those up. I'll just probably give you this exact chart tomorrow. Just try not to forget to. So you wanted the one with the 1 and the tan squared, right? 1 plus tan squared. That's secant squared. So let's go ahead and replace that. We have cosine squared times secant squared. Now the next thing, this isn't necessarily written on your paper, but it's just, well, it is indirectly. But secant is the same thing as 1 over cosine, right? So that means secant squared would be the same thing as 1 over cosine squared. So remember, while that isn't necessarily written on your paper, you can still use the fact that secant is 1 over cosine and write it that way. All right, now since these are opposites, they can cancel. So we get 1 equal 1. Let's do 19 as well. So I'm guessing probably that's the question for 19. So 19, notice we have a squared and a 1. So a secant squared, let's find that one. So the secant squared here, secant squared minus 1. And notice if you just subtract the 1 over, that will give you secant squared minus 1. So we want to replace secant squared minus 1 with tan squared. So this becomes tan squared over secant squared. We want to end up being equal to sine. So if our final answer is going to have a sine in it, right? Probably should change these to sines and cosines. Makes sense, right? So tan is the same thing as sine over cosine, which means tan squared is equivalent to sine squared over cosine squared. Secant is 1 over cosine, so 1 over cosine squared. Looks kind of nasty. It looks like we made it worse, but we're getting to the right spot now. So remember with these fractions and fractions, you keep change flip. So we will keep the top, sine squared over cosine squared. Change the multiplication and flip. So it flips the cosine squared over 1. We then get this cancellation. And then we just have sine squared equals sine squared. Okay. So we verified that. How about other ones? You guys want to see? Other ones people want to see? Yeah. So what I'm going to do, if you haven't finished this yet, you can still finish it. This is going to be needs to be turned in tomorrow. I want you to use it if in case you want to study tonight. You can look over this. And how I would recommend if you are going to use it to study and you already did it, is you can pull up to Google Classroom here. I posted that alright. I posted it there, so if you wanted to like look up and even like retry them, you can. I'm also going to post the answer